Great. Hello, everyone. I'm sure we'll have more people come in as it's just 8 now, so maybe we'll give people a couple minutes, but we're really excited that you're all here and especially excited to have Dr. Steinveg here as our speaker.
Okay, so I think we'll begin. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special event. My name's Nick Lesby, NAADSN's new network administrator. The North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network is a Department of National Defense Mines-funded research network addressing 3 core policy challenges from strong, secure, and engaged: defense in the Arctic, securing North America and enhancing continental defense, and climate change and the environment. NAADSN engages key academic experts and stakeholders across Canada, North America, and the circumpolar Arctic to produce timely research and advice to the defense team and to foster the next generation of scholars and practitioners. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Steinveg of Nord University and moderator Gabriella Gricius. Gabriella is NAADSN's media coordinator and research fellow and PhD candidate at Colorado State University, researching China and the Arctic. I will now turn the floor over to Gabriella. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nick, so much for that kind introduction. I know we're all really excited to hear Dr. Steinveg talk briefly about her book, so I'll keep my introduction of her short. So Dr. Steinveg is an associate professor in international relations at the Faculty of Social Sciences and the director of studies for the bachelor's in international relations at Nord University. She holds a doctorate in political science from the Arctic University in Tromsø, where she defended her thesis exploring the function of conferences for actors engaged in Arctic affairs, the impact of conferences for agenda setting, and the space for conferences in Arctic governance infrastructure. And her work today covers broadly Arctic governance, geopolitics, agenda setting, and foreign policy conduct. And as a reminder, as we're on Zoom, this event is being recorded, so we'd ask that while Dr. Steinveg is speaking, that you could mute your microphone and type your questions in the chat. We also have some questions that some participants sent in beforehand, so we'll look forward to those as well. And after Dr. Steinveg concludes her remarks, we'll turn to the audience for an open discussion of this wonderful book that we're all very excited to hear about. So without further ado.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for summarizing what I actually will be talking about today. So that's a good start. And I'm also very happy to be here today and to talk about my research on Arctic conferences. It's a very narrow field, and Gabriella is maybe one of the few others who are interested in researching these informal arenas. But so the question that I will ask and hopefully answer during my short presentation is why should we care about these conferences within Arctic governance? And I will try to keep it brief because I look very much forward to your questions and what I'm sure will be some very interesting discussions afterwards. Let's see if this works. Yes. So as you're probably aware of, there are many conferences arranged on Arctic issues every year, both within and outside the Arctic region. And this is just a small selection of the numerous arenas. But despite this fact, the studies and theories of international relations have been largely or are largely focused on states and state actors and formalized organizations and institutions. And within Arctic governance, the Arctic Council has been subject to much academic discussion and political debate. But I was interested in informal arenas and whether conferences could serve broader functions within the Arctic governance system beyond just being meeting places for people. So the starting point for my PhD project was that Arctic conferences was a neglected element within Arctic governance, and I was interested in uncovering their broader purpose among other entities in the region. So I will talk briefly about this study and present some key findings. So the two main cases in my PhD, which, as Gabriella mentioned, has also been published as a book recently, are the two largest international arenas on Arctic issues that are arranged annually. The first is the Arctic Frontiers in Tromsø, which has been arranged since 2007. And the second is the upcoming Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, Iceland, which has been arranged since 2013. So I was particularly interested in these two conferences because they combine policy, science, and business. And in addition, they attempt or aim to also include indigenous voices, local communities, and the younger generation. So I thought that this broad approach and quite diverse participant pool would make for an interesting inquiry into how these seemingly informal and in many ways quite casual gatherings could have an impact within the Arctic governance system and within international relations more broadly. So the first step of my research was to conduct a mapping of the Arctic Conference Fair, which has also been published as an article in the journal Arctic Review. And here we see that the number of Arctic conferences has grown quite extensively, and this development has followed general trends in the region. So the number of conferences has increased alongside the growing interest in the Arctic. For example, we see a peak in 2013 when non-Arctic states really started developing an interest in participating in Arctic affairs, and when China and the other Asian states applied to become observers to the Arctic Council. And Arctic conferences have also expanded in scope. So they started out as very science-oriented and often issue-specific arenas, and have become more kind of hybrid arenas that combine different sectors and levels of government. And I think that this development towards broader stakeholder involvement can be considered a success story within the Arctic regime. But it was not enough to establish that the number of conferences has grown. It's also necessary to ask why all these Arctic conferences have been established. So I wanted to uncover who benefits from conference participation and in what ways. So as Gabriella so nicely summarized, I looked at three mechanisms when I searched for the broader significance of Arctic conferences. The first is the function they serve for different actor groups. And the second is conferences as potential arenas for agenda setting. And the third was the space for conferences within the broader Arctic governance architecture. So looking at the actor mechanism, I identified 7 participant groups at conferences and examined whether conferences was a purposeful activity for these groups. So my hypothesis was that those on the outside of formalized Arctic governance structures, specifically non-Arctic states, would benefit more from conference participation than those on the inside of the Arctic governance system, such as the Arctic states, who are also members of the Arctic Council. But I found that conference participation was an important priority also for Arctic states and Arctic state representatives. And it was quite surprising to see how involved the Norwegian government was in the conduct and arrangement of the Arctic frontiers, for instance. As you may know, that the Arctic Circle Assembly was established by the Icelandic President Grimson. So of course, there's a strong connection to the Icelandic government as well. And these two conferences are used to a large extent to promote Norway and Iceland's priorities and interests in the Arctic. But of course, and perhaps not surprisingly, non-Arctic states also benefit from conference participation, and they use these arenas to argue for their status as legitimate stakeholders who have a right to participate in discussions about economic, environmental, security, and governance issues in the region. So we are all familiar with China's claim to be a near-Arctic state, and this statement is frequently repeated from the conference stage. And in like manner, Switzerland argued that it's a vertical Arctic state, Scotland is the gateway to the Arctic, and the US state of Maine is the port to the Arctic, and so on. But beyond state actors, there are other groups who benefit from engaging in conferences, such as the epistemic community, who use conferences for networking and agenda setting. Business representatives use conferences to claim that they are responsible actors who are engaged in sustainable economic development, and conferences can be stages for indigenous people representatives and local representatives to have their voices heard. So on the one side, conferences are arenas where states are not the only central actors. And I found that a quite diverse pool of stakeholders can benefit from participating. But at the same time, conferences in many ways also mirror the established power structures in the region, and they tend to advantage the most powerful voices and privileged coalitions. So looking at the agenda setting mechanism, I was interested in whether conferences can contribute to changing the Arctic agenda and whether they are useful arenas for people to promote their issues beyond the conference. And I found that conferences are particularly central for the identification of central issues and for common challenges in the region. And there are important stages for the science community to launch proposals and solutions to these identified problems, to push their issues, test out new ideas in an informal setting, and potentially also influence policymaking. And conferences are central for interest groups, advocacy coalition, and transnational networks who can engage in conferences and contribute to shaping the Arctic agenda. So this was quite a surprising finding for me. I expected that conferences would merely mirror the agenda that was set in more formalized forums within the region, but it's possible to trace agenda issues through and from conferences. So you can say that they also contribute to shaping the agenda in the region. So lastly, for the architecture mechanism, these conferences can function as useful connection among other entities within the Arctic regime complex. There are many entities working on overlapping or similar issues in the Arctic, and these can meet at conferences to kind of coordinate their work and create synergies. But within this mechanism, I was also particularly interested in how conferences fit together with the Arctic Council. And as you may know, there's been some friction between the Arctic Council and the Arctic Circle Assembly at some point, where the Arctic Council is not interested in the Arctic Circle Assembly being viewed as an alternative. So I was interested in these dynamics and looked at how conferences could supplement the Arctic Council. And for one, obviously the Arctic Council has a limited agenda, both due to time constraints and the fact that the Council cannot discuss military and security issues. So here, conferences can serve a very useful supplement for people to discuss issues that cannot be discussed through the Arctic Council. And secondly, the Arctic Council struggle with incorporating the observers in a meaningful way, also somewhat due to time constraints. So conferences are a particularly useful supplement that expands the number of actors who can participate in the discussion about the future of the region and who can promote their own interest and priorities. And China is maybe the best example of this, which is a state that's not satisfied with the space that it's given within the Arctic Council, but use as particularly the Arctic Circle Assembly as an arena to promote its interests in the region. And thirdly, conferences are also useful for the Arctic Council itself, which maybe has a communication challenge and can use these arenas to promote its work and communicate its activities. So I will sum up by presenting this ideal model of a conference that I constructed for the book version of my dissertation, and trying to pin down what it is that a conference should do. So first and foremost, a conference contributes to relationship building. It's an arena for networking and developing new connections and maintaining established connections. But conferences are also a space for deal making among participants. So politicians can learn about the priority areas of other states, scientists can discuss their works with international colleagues, and business representatives can find partners and customers. Thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, conferences can be arenas for bolstering government leadership. They can promote state interests and assert state dominance within a territory or an issue, as Norway uses the Arctic Frontiers for, and Iceland the Arctic Circle Assembly. And fourth, a conference can be a marketplace for the promotion of ideas among different stakeholders. So they can contribute to broadening the ways that an issue is perceived by including a wider set of voices. And the fifth characteristic of a conference is that it is a performance space for democratic values such as equality, transparency, and openness. So President Grimson himself, he calls the Arctic Circle Assembly an open tent where everyone is welcome in. And the conference is also, as mentioned, a space for agenda setting through presentations from the stage, proceedings, but also media attention and the work of journalists who attend these arenas. And the seventh characteristic of a conference, which is a particularly important one, is that the conference is more what takes place on the main stage. It serves as a magnet for side events and side meetings. And lastly, a conference can be a legitimizing tool for participants who seek to establish themselves as experts within a field or as relevant stakeholders within a domain. So I will conclude by addressing the question that I asked initially: why should we care about conferences? Well, for one, because conferences are considered important arenas for central actors in the region. So if they were of no significance, state leaders and others would not attend them. So we can therefore expect that actors can use conferences to advance their interests and priorities. And this is an aspect of Arctic governance that I think, or that we should pay attention to, because conferences can be arenas for the formulation and development of policy. And for another, conferences are important for agenda setting in the Arctic. What takes place at these arenas do not happen in a vacuum, and it can contribute to driving developments forward. Of course, this depends on participants themselves and that people attend these arenas with a purpose and wanting to bring something back to their institution or their work. And lastly, conferences have contributed to maintaining peaceful relations in the Arctic, also through turbulent times in other areas of international relations. So we can ask if this model of broad stakeholder involvement can serve as an example for international cooperation when attempting to solve common challenges. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steinveg. That was so interesting. I feel like I have a million questions. So I'll just ask the first question and give people some time to formulate their thoughts. So you mentioned that you thought it was really surprising because you thought that conferences would mirror some of the formal forums in the region, like Arctic Council, but that they didn't mirror it in exactly the same way. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit more on that. In what ways are they especially distinct from formal institutions?
I think what most informants, yeah, I can mention that too, that my study is based on interviews with both organizers and participants and people engaged in Arctic governance. And what most people said when I asked why they were at these conferences is that they mentioned the relaxed atmosphere, that they could feel that they could talk without these binding mandates, and it's free space for kind of brainstorming, which I think people appreciate, that it's allowed to throw out ideas and see what sticks. But at the same time, it's important, when I say informal arenas and casual gatherings, it's not like anyone off the streets can just walk into these conferences. So it's also, I think it's important to be aware of who can afford to go, who is representing the community. When we talk about local representatives or indigenous representatives, who are they speaking for? Is that it's not like people, it's not a democratic process electing people to go to these conferences. So it's also, I think, important to be aware of the kind of elitist characteristics as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question, but I don't know if anyone else does before I jump in. Kate, do you have a question? I noticed your video is on.
Just observing for now. Had a few, but Gabriella covered the first one, so still thinking.
Okay, so my question is, how do paradiplomatic actors like Alaska, Greenland, the Canadian territories, how do they use these conferences to achieve their own objectives or pursue them within a wider international system?
Yeah, well, again, particularly the Arctic Circle Assembly is used by these sub-regional and kind of smaller actors within the system to, if you study the programs of the previous conferences, you see that these actors often operate in collaboration with each other. And you have this energy triangle between Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland, who present together in the plenary, and they organize breakout sessions together. And President Grimson, who is the chairman of the Arctic Circle Assembly, is very preoccupied with this, to also include the sub-regional and lower levels of government. He wants to be a kind of forum for these actors to have their voices heard. And I think that's also like an important supplement that these conferences have to the Arctic Council, where the regional and local level is not represented. And it's the state actors, and often the capital is it's not in the Arctic, at least not here in Norway or Sweden or Finland. And the local level in the Arctic is not heard to a large extent through the Arctic Council. Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Hi, thanks very much for a great talk. And sorry, I missed the first 5 minutes, so this may have been covered, but I was just wondering, did you notice particular groups sort of meeting using the Arctic Circle as a way to meet in groups that otherwise couldn't get together, or because of geopolitics were frustrated? I was wondering if you had a chance to observe that and maybe see what clumpings one would see. I mean, a bit like, high school. Who was hanging out with whom?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. More formally, I know that the Arctic Mayors Forum of mayors from across the circumpolar north, they have this meetings in conjunction with the Arctic Frontiers and also the Arctic Circle Assembly. So it's kind of beneficial if you go there for the conference. You can also do these other side meetings. I conducted my research in the period from 2016 to 2020, so the geopolitical situation was somewhat calmer. It wasn't it would be interesting to do a follow-up study today, both post-COVID, but also after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine to see. But the obvious answer is that maybe these conferences have been, what people have told me about what took place before I started attending this is that they have been very important arenas to amend conflicts or tensions between the East and the West. So Russian and US participants have been able to meet at these gatherings through these informal settings and discuss science and research and collaborations without kind of binding mandates or restrictions from government. Yeah.
Great. And so just a follow up. So would you say that the participants that go would be sort of a lower level from what you would see at more formal meetings, or would you find that heads of states found this an opportunity to have a quick side conversation in a hallway somewhere?
I don't know the answer to the last part of the question, but my impression is that heads of state attend the Arctic Circle Assembly to a larger extent than the Arctic Frontiers, but when they do, they fly in, they hold their keynote, and they fly out. So I think if we look at policy or the governmental level, I think these conferences are much more important for the lower levels of government to kind of track to diplomacy. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrea. We have one question from a research fellow that wasn't able to be here today that I'll just read out now. They were curious about the role of Arctic Circle Assembly forums. So just in the way that they have, these forums in China or Berlin, I think this spring, and they were curious sort of how that fit into your understanding of conferencing.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. I was also very interested in these forums. When you look at it, it makes no sense that there should be an Arctic Circle, Arctic Forum in Shanghai or Singapore or Berlin or Tokyo. And I think that this is very much part of President Grimson's own vision to kind of make the Arctic a global issue, and also to bring the global to the Arctic. So he wants the discussion about the Arctic to be a global discussion, and which is why he takes his kind of organization to other parts of the world to engage with regional and state actors there to promote the Arctic. But it's also an interesting, I don't know if I want to call it tool, but it's an interesting, these forums are an interesting, kind of means for these actors who get to host them, because then China can talk about its Arctic policy and they can promote their visions and interest for the region. So of course, I don't think these forums necessarily are welcomed by all the Arctic states who want to keep the discussion about the Arctic among the Arctic states within the Arctic Council. So these forums are a way to kind of broaden the number and scope of actors who can have an opinion on the Arctic to a much larger extent, and to promote their perspectives. Yeah.
So interesting. And then just as a follow-up, you've mentioned Grimson quite a few times, obviously, and you talked about the role of Iceland and Norway as sort of really using these conferences as a way to promote themselves. So I was just curious, how do you delineate between the role of individuals like Grimson, who's obviously so influential in the Icelandic case, versus the government of Iceland in general? Or is it like individual driven, or is there something more governmental behind it?
I think this is something that the two cases kind of distinguish. It's a distinction between the two cases, that in the Icelandic case, it's very much a personal quest of President Grimson. So it was his initiative, and he has some very clear visions about where he wants to take the dialogue about the Arctic and what he wants to do with the Arctic Council, the Arctic Circle Assembly, kind of what his legacy is going to be, I think. But in the Norwegian case, it's much more the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that's involved. And so it's on a broader governmental level. It's not individually driven. And it's important also to underline that the Arctic Frontiers, it's not the kind of arena for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's an independent organization and so on. But the program and everything is conducted quite in line with Norwegian interests and Norwegian visions for the Arctic, I think.
Very, very interesting, I think. Maybe personally interesting, but just fascinating. Does anyone else have any questions? I don't want to monopolize the floor here. Go ahead, Kate.
Okay, so I've really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm queuing up reading the book and the article that you presented on. And I was just wondering, I know that conferences are said to help set agendas quite often, and I guess this is like other conferences as well that do that. But did you come across any metrics of like how often somebody's brought some new concept up and then it has actually ended up in government policy, or if you could talk about like how it actually gets, I guess, adopted? I appreciate it. Thanks.
I don't have any metrics on that, but I think that these conferences, as I mentioned, are more kind of testing grounds to see what sticks, and maybe most importantly, if a state develops a new policy, and particularly maybe an Arctic policy, it's not the broadest community that's interested in this or that picks up on it. But these conferences are very much used by states to launch their Arctic policies. So Scotland has done it, and China and so on, so that they can use these arenas to attract a broader audience. So I think that's an quite important function for states, and particularly non-Arctic states, that they get kind of a stage to describe what they want to do and how they see themselves in the Arctic.
And I guess as a bit of a follow-up that is sort of a bit tangential to my first question, but I was wondering how well China and other non-Arctic actors or near-Arctic actors, whatever they're purporting to be, I'm wondering how well they're received in the international community in terms of the actual Arctic like states and other people who live in the area.
I think, or they are received quite skeptically, I think, among the Arctic states. And again, here is a distinction between the two cases in my study where President Grimson or the Arctic Circle Assembly openly welcomes in China and actively tries to give them a stage, because the philosophy is that everyone who has an interest in the Arctic should be able to participate in the dialogue, regardless of whether it's Himalaya or Norway. China probably feels more welcome at the Arctic Circle Assembly than at the Arctic Frontiers, which has a policy more in line with the Norwegian approach to Arctic governance, that it should be within the hands of the Arctic states. And the Arctic Frontiers has a close collaboration with the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Frontiers, to a much larger extent, kind of mirrors the Arctic Council, with members on the inside and then others on the outside, while President Grimson has his open tent where everyone is welcomed in. And of course, there have been a lot of issues with Chinese investments in the Arctic, which are not welcomed by the Arctic state governments, who view these very skeptically. While China uses the conference stage to argue for why they have benign interests with these economic investments and so on. So there's an interesting dynamic and kind of narrative competition going on, I think. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Erin, you have a question?
Thanks for your presentation. And I have a question, and apologies if you've already touched on it and I just somehow missed it. But I'm wondering how size matters in these different conferences, because like when we think of like the Arctic Circle, like at least pre-pandemic, you know, upwards of 2,000 people could be there at any given time. And how you know, do things like this make a difference when you're, say, a community representative or a scientist or somebody who's trying to, you know, gain access to the people who are there? Like, sure, it's open and it's free, and in theory you could walk up to like the politician or policymaker, but like there's side meetings and time, and like 50 people could be around, you know, like following that person, right? So I'm just wondering how, if you notice there's a difference in like size and maybe which forums there's better access or better opportunities to engage with like the policymakers, and, you know, for people to actually connect beyond their own, you know, scientists beyond scientists, and, you know, stuff like that.
That's a very, very interesting question. And I think the answer depends on who you ask. If you ask the organizer, they will say that the size matters a lot, and we are the largest, and we have 3,000 participants from X amount of countries, etc. But I think, as it was one informant who said that this has become a competition of participants and numbers, it should be a competition of impact, about impact. So it's for those who have attended the Arctic Circle Assembly, I think the word circus comes to mind. It's so much happening at the same time, and you're just running from session to session. And I have not been there since COVID, so I don't know. It's probably grown even bigger after they opened up again. And I know they have breakout sessions from 7 in the morning till midnight. And as you mentioned, it's almost like it's too many people. So what I would always kind of advise young researchers to do is to contact these people that you want to meet in advance and ask if they're going to this conference, and whether you can arrange a meeting with them beforehand. Because I think when it's 2,000-3,000 participants, and bumping into the right person at the right time is very difficult. So I would always go to these events with a plan to with the people I was going to meet, and also with a plan of the events that I was going to, because it's very huge.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. Right, go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering if you found any difference in the variation between like the conferences and then the more formal like forums in terms of like non-state actors. I know you'd mentioned earlier when answering a question the linkage with the Arctic Mayors Forum, and I was wondering if you saw that link as like a potential benefit to getting like further involvement in terms of non-state actors, and whether that's like a model that should be like used more going forward.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And again, if you ask President Grimson, he would say yes, that this model of his conference should be expanded internationally. But I think that he has a point. As I mentioned, a lot of the criticism towards these conferences has come from them being kind of elitist arenas where you have policymakers flying in and out and holding keynotes, and nothing happens from it. And I think the involvement of non-state actors and a broader group of stakeholders, if you want to call it that it is something that one should really strive for. But then again, this is also, none of these conferences are ideal in this regard either. Both the Arctic Frontiers and the Arctic Circle Assembly has received quite a lot of criticism in the way that they try to include Indigenous people. So they are often not included in the discussion about themselves. So there was this situation at the Arctic Frontiers a couple of years ago when a woman from an Indigenous woman stood up from the audience while there was a presentation, like a panel on stage discussing Indigenous issues with no Indigenous people in the panel, and she was furious, and with right. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I think that it's something one should strive for if the real aim is to make some positive outcomes and to drive developments forward, then one should strive to include all those who are touched by these issues, and not just a representative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who reads a pre-prepared script from the stage.
Awesome, thanks so much.
I also had a question that I'll interject with, more of a current affairs question. I was curious how you see conferences, Arctic conferences specifically, as a venue for Russia post-February 2022. So I was at the Arctic Circle Assembly last year, and I remember everyone commenting how there was barely anyone from Russia there, maybe obviously so. But I was just curious, maybe looking forward in the future, do you see that as maybe a potential forum, like you mentioned, for alleviating East-West tensions, or will it just be a tool of that Russia will see as a tool of exclusion, let's say, and sort of use that as a rationale for saying it's being pushed out of Arctic governance?
I think that's a very interesting and very hard question. And very, it's, I think it depends on what level you look at. When I interviewed people who have been in this Arctic governance game almost as long as I've lived, they use this, they told stories about how they would meet with other researchers and scientists at conferences, also like American and Russian during the Cold War, and how they use these conferences to engage with colleagues from the other states even then. So I think maybe that these conferences could be spaces where you could start to include Russian participants, maybe not at the governmental level, but scientists and researchers and so on. But of course, there are also conferences, Arctic conferences arranged in Russia, and President Putin has his International Arctic Forum, which has been attended by government representatives from all the Arctic states and has functioned in many ways as a communication channel for him and then Russian interests in the Arctic. So it's, I think also in this regard, it's important not just to neglect the impact or the function that these arenas can actually have, but maybe it could be like a first step towards more inclusion again. I don't know.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question, I think going back to Rory's question a little bit, but do you have any tips for conference goers at these huge events where, like you said, it starts at 7 a.m. and goes well into the night? And if you're interested in a lot of panels, how do you kind of choose?
Yeah, wear comfortable shoes. No, I think planning in advance is my number one tip, that to really have a look at the program and see what sessions you would want to prioritize, and to reach out to people beforehand, because everyone is busy, and all the I've sometimes thought that, oh, I will just probably bump into this person, or I will arrange it while I'm there. It never works. So the best thing to do is to try to set up meetings and so on beforehand, and to make your own calendar of breakout sessions and so that you want to attend. Then of course, it's for the breakout session organizers, it's also competition to get audience to go. So yeah, it's a hard game. I think what will be interesting to follow at this year's Arctic Circle Assembly, for those who are going there, is the presence and communication by the Arctic Council, because obviously the Arctic Council is in a very difficult position now with Norway taking over the chairmanship or chairship from Russia, and where does the Arctic Council go now, with or without Russia? And I think they will have a quite extensive presence at this year's Arctic Circle Assembly. So I think it will be interesting to follow what they are communicating and how they are using that conference to talk about what they're doing. So I would prioritize those sessions.
That's great. Thank you.
I mean, speaking about the Arctic Council, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that there was some friction between the Arctic Circle Assembly and the Arctic Council, but now it seems like they need to use this forum, right, to represent their legitimacy. So could you talk a little bit about that? It's just I don't know that much about the friction, so love to hear more.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting development, because when the Arctic Circle Assembly was introduced by President Grimson in April 2013. This was right before the Arctic Council minister meeting in Kiruna in May in 2013, when they were going to decide on the observers applications of China and the other Asian states. And some perceived this initiative that President Grimson launched as kind of like trying to push the Arctic states to accept China and the other observers or other Asian states as observers, while others say that no, this had nothing to do with it, and the Arctic Council made its own decision. So depends on who you ask, but obviously when the Arctic Circle Assembly then was held for the first time in October that year, the Asian states had been accepted as observers, but a lot of the Arctic states were still very skeptical towards this new open tent that was being held in Reykjavik, and Norway and the US did not send government representatives at the highest level to the first assembly. So, and I think it's about the skepticism probably stems from the rhetoric that President Grimson used, this inclusive language, and that everyone should have their voices heard and everyone has a right to participate in the dialogue, etc. While the Arctic states, or at least some of them, are more interested in keeping Arctic governance within themselves, and that they are the Arctic rights holders and no other actors. But then we see this, I mean, it's been 10 years now since the first Arctic Circle Assembly, so I guess that time has gone past, and they have seen that, okay, this is no threat to the Arctic Council in any way. The Arctic Council does what the Arctic Council does, and then this conference has a different function. So maybe the Arctic Council now sees more the how they can use these arenas to supplement their communication and their work. We have a question.
Yeah, Bridget, please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for your dedication to this work, and I look forward to reading the book. As an Indigenous person, and I'm a senior advisor to the Arctic Athabascan Council, but I'm also a former executive director of Witch and Council International. But I also played a huger role in the creation of the Arctic Council as a Canadian delegate. So I'm really interested in, I think, the legitimacy of the Arctic Council, and especially now as we move forward. And just to give you, some background, you probably already know, like the decision for the pause and the, refusing to work with Russia clearly didn't include the voices of the permanent participants. Then there's a lot of language going around to referencing the permanent participants that have a distinct title and status within the Arctic Council as Indigenous peoples organizations. And those could be anybody within a state. So that title in itself, I get concerned with, because the permanent participants are a distinct group of 6 Indigenous peoples. So I'm wondering if you had any lengthy conversations with them about the current state of the Arctic Council, the legitimacy, and even the 26 years or the 25 years of Arctic Council, pre and post, or pre and continuing Russia war in Ukraine. I think for me, where I'm going with this is are the permanent participants actually thinking about other venues And I know they use the United Nations a lot, especially the Sami and the indigenous peoples within the Russian borders use the United Nations a lot. So is there still a lot of credibility, have you heard, from the PERM participants and their connection with the Arctic Council?
That's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, my study is, ended in 2020. So as I defended my thesis in 2021, but I think this would be a very, very interesting follow-up study to do, to look at how these identified participant groups, how they now in this current situation view these conferences and their opportunities to collaborate and have their voices heard in the very new situation that we find ourselves in. What I can say about conferences or the indigenous perspective of conferences from the period that my book is written from is that I think those that I spoke to from the indigenous communities, they feel that they are more represented through the Arctic Council because they have this permanent participant status, and that conferences in some way sometimes try to check off indigenous inclusion, but they are not really included in the formulation of the program or in the panels and sessions in the way that they should be.
Thank you for that. And yeah, just to follow up, and I don't want to take up all of your time either.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, for sure. That does happen, is that as soon as they know that we're going to be there, like my email inbox has just been bombarded with, can I meet with you, or can you be a part of this? And they've contributed nothing to our participation. So that is a concern we have, is that they'll say, oh, well, we were at this venue and we were, the indigenous people said this. So, the whole intellectual property rights are, that our voices then get distorted, get misused, misrepresented, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Well, we're nearing the end of our hour. So does anyone have any final questions before I ask a future leading question for Dr. Steinveg? Okay. So you mentioned that obviously this book project, everything that you've been working on, sort of rounding up your doctorate, looking forward. What are you interested in researching going forward? Do you want to continue the study, or your interests moving into other areas? What can we expect to read from you, in the next couple of years?
Well, I have been moving into other areas, doing research on other issues. When I was done with my PhD, I swore that I would never research conferences again. But then of course there have been some very interesting developments, and now looking over this material again, preparing for this presentation, I was like, there's a lot of interesting things that one could do here. And I think it would be particularly interesting to look at these arenas post Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it might be a study worth conducting, because it's interesting times, and as kind of the gap between Russia and the other Arctic states just keep expanding every day as the war goes on. I think that if there's going to be any place that one could try to at some point meet again, maybe it's at these conferences. So I might dive into that. Maybe you want to join.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope I speak for all of us here that this was such an incredibly interesting presentation, discussion, and we really appreciate having you here, and we'll be excited to see your work in the future.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you this, I guess, morning for you and afternoon for me. Thank you.
Thank you.